Hi again then guys, and welcome to the final vehicle review from the most recent DLC pack on GT Sport for probably the car which most people were anticipating the least, you could say. There are probably some people which were really looking forward to it, maybe even some people who wanted it more than all of the others, but for most of us, I don't think that's the case. It is of course the Suzuki Swift Sport, and although this car certainly wouldn't stand out from the crowd in Gran Turismo Sport or in really any racing game that it's featured in, it's not a bad car for sure, and we'll get into that more in a second and the ways that it's potentially improved, but in a more general sense, this is the car which I was looking forward to the least out of all of them, because it wasn't a car that I used a huge amount in Gran Turismo's past anyway. It was introduced of course on Gran Turismo 5, then we had two needless versions really on Gran Turismo 6, there was no reason to have two of them, and now we have this slightly updated version again. Because there were certain vehicles on Gran Turismo 6 which were already what many people were calling PS4 ready. Stuff like the GTR Nismo for instance. The graphics looked so good that many people thought that it could pretty much just be ported straight over to Gran Turismo Sport. Now, that's not really the case. If you're honest about it and look at the Gran Turismo 6 graphics, even on those amazing looking cars for the time, and compare them to even the most basic looking ones now, no, not really. That car wasn't ready to come over to the game at all, and if they do, you would notice immediately that it doesn't look as realistic. However, the Swift, in a similar way to the Nismo, was actually one of the cars which already looked pretty good on Gran Turismo 6 and even Gran Turismo 5. It's a very realistic looking render of the car, the lighting is good, the shape is, well, of course the shape is good, the shape of the cars is always very accurate on Gran Turismo, and that's actually one of my personal favourite things about the franchise as a whole. There are many racing games which quite simply get certain cars wrong. Even Forza, as hugely popular as it is, and I love the franchise, there are certain cars on there which are just straight up wrong. The Zonda, for instance, looks ridiculous on the older games. However, Gran Turismo has always had their cars amazingly well rendered into the game in terms of their proportions, and this was one of those, even on Gran Turismo 5 when we first started getting those premium, proper HD cars, if you will. You could immediately see the kind of quality that was going to come from the graphics side of the franchise. That has remained the same with this car. Now the interior and the exterior, although it's less notable with the exterior, has of course been updated. The detail is finer, the lighting is much better now, but in terms of the way it performs, it's fairly similar, because I would describe the Swift Sport in as much as it's a nice hot hatch. It's not a remarkable one, it's not an amazing one, it's certainly not a mind-blowing one, and I can't really think of a top 10 list of any type that this one would feature in. Top 10 Suzukis? Possibly, but even then you could probably come up with a better 10. Not that this is a bad car, it's just nothing really to write home about. In the real world, cars like this have a ton of use. They are nice cars, they're more affordable performance cars, which are genuine hot hatches, but at the same time on the much lower end of the spectrum. And of course this car has some great rivals, such as one of my personal favourites, the Fiat Panda 100 HP. Now this has more than 100 horsepower, it's got 123 horsepower stock, 109 pound-feet of torque, and as you'd assume, it's not very heavy. It weighs 1,060 kilos, which is a little bit over a tonne. 116 horsepower per tonne is decent enough for a car like this, and the engine, which is a 1.6 litre, it's thumpy enough. Of course, it's front-wheel drive, as you'd expect, and it's dirt cheap. At 16 grand, it's one of the cheapest cars on Gran Turismo Sport. But in terms of the ways in which this car is actually improved, and also in a more general sense and a more abstract way, the relevance which this car has, I do have a couple of thoughts. The first, in terms of how much it's been improved, if at all, is that just like the others, the primary way in which this car has been improved, beyond the obvious graphics, is the handling. But in the case of the Swift Sport, it hasn't seen as much of a drastic update. For instance, the Stingray is a whole world better than it has ever been before. I would say probably my favourite update of the pack in terms of handling. The RX-7 feels fantastic, both of the Skylines feel great, especially the R34 I would say, and a number of others feel better than they ever have before. Now technically you could also say that about this car. It does feel more authentic than it ever has. for the same reasons. The tyre deformity, suspension travel, damper feel, it's all great. But the Swift is a much slower car than many of those are. But beyond that, it was already a pretty good small super mini style hot hatch on Gran Turismo 5 and 6, so the update hasn't really affected this car as drastically as some of the others, because of course it's much slower anyway, so you're not going to notice those differences as much. In terms of tuning, obviously its top end potential, in terms of power and weight, is different, but again, it's not going to blow your mind, of course not, it's not that kind of car. But the more abstract way in which I do find significance in this car, and one of the reasons why I'm reviewing it as well, beyond just a minor potential update to its physics and handling, is what this car represents. Because many of the cars in this pack, as I've touched on before in the specific reviews, are actually very important in a way that's not really related to them directly, but more the category of car that they are. For instance, the JDM cars, the iconic JDM cars returning to the game, the Ford Raptor returning trucks to the franchise, before that the Cobra being a harbinger of classics returning, and now we've seen even more do so. This is another such occasion. Now it's not as radical, for instance we already had hot hatches on the game, but what I mean by that is that this one represents the return of Suzuki, and although for many people that's not a huge thing, it is a significant one to fans of the brand, and also for the brand's future in the world of Gran Turismo, because of course there are a ton of brands which simply aren't in the game anymore, many of which we would love to see back, like TVR, Shazetta for me personally, potentially Lotus, Ginetta, a number of others, Jensen even from a little older back, tons of others. This though is another one to add to the list. Regardless of how much you love or potentially even dislike the brand, it is nice to have another fresh face added to the roster, and albeit a returning one, it's still a new face nonetheless. So the car itself isn't amazing, but having Suzuki back is pretty nice. So that's it overall for my thoughts on the Swift Sport in its updated GT Sport form, and of course you can check out plenty more reviews for the cars in the pack here on the channel. But over the coming days we'll be returning to the usual schedule with the Vision GT reviews and various others, and of course tuning as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the next DLC pack could bring, probably another combination of old and new faces. But that's it overall for this pick. I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.